Hey guys, welcome back to Through Tactics FPL. It's Fran here and I'm back with this week's cheat sheet. For Game Week 15, we really don't have too many changes to make. I think your transfers this week are really depending on whether you want to roll this week, whether you have 2 free transfers to attack the last 2 game weeks, or maybe whether you'd like to employ a strategy where you'd like to target Game Week 16 specifically, because we do still have some great teams that do have great matchups, specifically in 16, but not necessarily in 15. Crystal Palace is a good example of that, where they do get to play Nottingham Forest. Anyways, let's actually start off with the midfielders. As far as Nelson, you do have him potentially playing. I really think he's going to come off the bench for this Arsenal game. I actually was at the Arsenal game where they were playing versus Zurich. Fantastic atmosphere, but I do think Martinelli will start. He clearly was rested. Saka also was rested and came on for around 20 minutes of gameplay. Saka looks fit and ready to go. Nelson was actually interestingly moved towards the left-hand side of the field when Saka came on, and I do think there's potential that maybe Martinelli could be substituted early on in the game if let's say he's not having a particularly good game, and therefore Reece Nelson can actually come on both wings. And I feel like depending on how this Chelsea derby game is going to go, we could see Nelson actually sub on for both the left winger or the right winger in this situation. So he is an interesting punt at this price, but are you going to waste the transfer on him? I really don't think that's going to be the case, and unfortunately this week I think he's going to be in a void for that reason. Potentially later in the season he could displace one of the players, probably more than likely Martinelli. But at this point in time, I just can't see the punt working out, and I would not move into Nelson this week. If we talk about the 5.0, 5.9 players, we have clearly some changes here because the Brighton actually have a 2 game week window that's fantastic. And you have Wolves here and an Aston Villa team, at least where Brighton are playing at home. And we've seen some great performances where Brighton have been able to play well at home lately, specifically the Chelsea game, of course. And then Wolves simply are still a team in dire straits. I think just in terms of squad depth, in terms of their performances lately, nothing really that we can glean on and suggest that this Wolves team are capable of really putting up much of an effort versus what I would say is a Brighton team that coming off a fantastic Chelsea win. And yes, of course, we've seen Brighton also be relatively quiet when it comes down to games outside of the Liverpool game, outside of the Chelsea game, specifically the Nottingham Forest game, and then also the Brentford game. And I guess there is a bit of a toss-up here. A lot of people might allude to the fact that Brighton are very good at matching up versus some of the bigger teams, and not necessarily now the mid-table and potentially even the bottom half. But I have to think you have to just play with what we've seen so far. And I think recently, of course, the performances have been encouraging, at least in terms of the chances created for Brighton. So I do think options like Gross and McAllister do present themselves as decent options this week. As is someone who does fall, simply put, Crystal Palace have 1 out of 2 bad fixtures. When you're really looking at the comparisons here, Everton midfielders actually have much better matchups, which is why I brought them onto the cheat sheet. Even Gibbs White actually arguably has 2 good games, seeing that they're actually playing at home. And Billing obviously has 2 great games himself as well. Everton at home and then Leeds away. A Leeds team that aren't necessarily informed, but did actually manage to snag a win away from Liverpool. And then also getting that Everton game at home seems to be quite nice because we do know that this Everton team have posted some great results, but specifically when they're playing at home themselves. As far as 6.0, 6.9 players, no real changes here other than a drop towards Martinelli. I've also added Odegaard to the cheat sheet this week, so that is a kind of hybrid change that we've seen introduced into the cheat sheet. I just think that Odegaard, of course, has been getting increasingly involved. I also think that Martinelli's minutes will start to tail off this season, so it might be a little bit more interesting to pivot into Odegaard later on. His underlying stats are actually not too bad. They are quite high, specifically for a player, I would say, playing with such a quality team such as Arsenal that are capable of getting, first of all, clean sheets and then also producing so many creative chances between all the players. I mean, you can see, for example, this season that Granit Xhaka was considered as an option. He's only been taken off the cheat sheet this week because I do think Odegaard has emerged as a slightly better option than Granit. And as I said, if you're not really keen into Martinelli, and maybe later in the season we'd like to move away from Martinelli, I do think there's scope to move into Odegaard. If you're someone who can't afford Saka, I can understand also moving into Odegaard, but I probably would only force that move in Game Week 16 if you see that as a great opportunity to target this very, very poor Wolves team. But it's just one to keep an eye on, whereas I have dropped Martinelli this week. Rodrigo and Barnes still have 1 out of 2 good games. Nothing really to say here. They are clearly third-tier options because they just simply don't have the 2 great fixtures. And that's pretty much what the cheat sheet comes down to. In the second half of the midfielders, I feel like the changes here do have to go with a little bit of a preliminary discussion of Man City. We have been suffering as of late, especially Foden owners, with the minutes situation. And I think you have to look into whether we're able to get early leaked news. I have to suggest that if you're able to stay close to the deadline, hoping to, let's say, stay 15 minutes before the deadline. We have been getting some recent news for the early fixture, so if you can do that, try to look into that, because that might color on whether you'd like to make moves over players like Foden this week, whether you'd like to move into De Bruyne, or even, let's say, laterally into a move like a Bernardo this week. As I say, these projections for the cheat sheet really are based on me expecting that all these players are going to start. So Foden in the last 2 weeks was the green option, simply because we expected Foden to start these games and at least play, specifically since he got benched in game week 13. But as it turns out, in 13 and 14, he was benched for both games. Also because Pep was prioritizing the Champions League and allowing him to play there for 90 minutes. And that's really been terrible for FPL managers. But as you can see, Foden still seems like someone who's worth keeping if he's able to start. So as I say, wait for the leaked news and see if you'd like to make a move on Foden, because we just have 2 fixtures towards the World Cup. So it is very important to capitalize on game week 15, because if you, let's say, keep Foden, you're only really capitalized on 16, and therefore someone who has already made to a move for someone like Bowen, who has great fixtures both on 15 and 16, could have benefited, net overall. In terms of the cheaper option, Zaha remains at the top. He is the one option here that actually still remains in a green spot, with the exception to Salah here, who actually has a tough fixture that I would still like to keep. And that's simply because the ceiling of that Nottingham Forest fixture is just so high. We've seen that most teams pretty much have their best hauls, and even individually, you see a lot of players just getting involved within Nottingham Forest fixture games, and that's because their defense is so poor overall. Look at Arsenal last week, where Martinelli, Odegaard, Jesus, Xhaka were all involved, even Reece Nelson, of course, coming off the bench. And this is a great opportunity for someone like Zaha to absolutely benefit from that. Specifically also because with the landscape of FPL right now, with some players having some really, really poor situations, like Foden, who could be benched for 1 game, maybe Bernardo potentially could be benched for 1 game, which I don't think is very likely. But you have these opportunities, right, where it could be seen as scope for a manager like Pep Guardiola to, let's say, rest even De Bruyne, and you can't really anticipate that for now, but this is very close to the World Cup, and I think obviously managers will try to play their first string teams as much as possible. This is the reality coming off of once again a very kind of rough European week for most teams outside of Man City, who are already qualified. As far as Bernardo, of course, he does remain as a second tier option. You could actually see him as a very easy transfer away from Foden if, let's say, Bernardo is confirmed to start. I do much prefer Bernardo over Grealish as an option, even though Bernardo at times plays very, very deep. I just think that the X factor is actually there with Bernardo. He's been very consistent. Worst case, you could just get 1 assist from him, and you'd probably benefit, right, over the next 2 weeks. Foden, of course, is someone who has variability, where at times we've seen him get these double-digit hauls or nothing. And yeah, as I say, hope that we get the early team news and it can actually make moves away from that, because as I say, Bowen is such a tempting transfer away from Foden. If you get news and get wind that Foden won't start, Bowen is a very, very easy move to make. And specifically in a week where Saka himself doesn't have a great fixture, which is why Saka's been dropped, you can also just capitalize, let's say, next week, where you can just look at someone like Saka, who also has a great game independently, which is versus Wolves. A lot of players across the table, I would say, have great fixtures on 16. And you can see even here with Tottenham and Liverpool that Salah and Son are both involved in some relatively tough games, even though Salah has been someone who's done incredibly well in these big fixtures in recent memory. So De Bruyne for me is a very easy move away from Foden as well, specifically if you're a type of manager who actually has 2 free transfers. If you get news that, let's say, Haaland and Foden both don't start, Haaland and Alvarez has been a very highly suggested move by most people, and for a very good reason. We have the most expectations from the City team to actually deliver, and the easiest moves in terms of your available budget are going to be those 2 players. You could even force a hit towards these 2 players, specifically if you have that kind of ownership pairing of Foden and Haaland. I think that's a very good way to circumvent that situation. But of course, keep in mind that you will also potentially suffer when, let's say, someone like Alvarez, who could be benched in game week 16. So that for me doesn't feel so good as a hit, but I think, let's say, moving away from Foden is probably quite a logical move if he doesn't start, and moving from Haaland to Kane is actually quite an interesting option if we think about Man City overall. And that's going to be the lay of the land for the midfielders. Moving into the forwards, you have one change here that is quite crucial, which is going to be the move away from Mitrovic into someone else in a cheaper position. Obviously, you now have Alvarez as an option. Keep in mind, of course, lower down this list, we talk about Haaland as an asterisk, and I did speak about Alvarez being an option when we talked about the midfielders and what to do with the situation with Foden, and obviously the emergence of De Bruyne, or the re-emergence of De Bruyne at his full peak. You now have Solanke, who actually has a great fixtures for game weeks 15 and 16, and Mitrovic, of course, on the opposite end of that, having terrible fixtures for both 15 and 16 with City and United. Obviously, Mitrovic has proven to be an asset that is fixture-proof. We might even have some bigger issues or bigger fish to fry, really, in our teams for 15 and 16, so you might want to skip the move. But I do think it's very reasonable to move away from Mitrovic now. You just had the Everton game come and go, and now you've got an opportunity to invest into another forward who has great fixtures. Solanke is interesting to me because he plays these 90-minute games. Scamacca, of course, for me, is a little bit more of a differential pick, and obviously I put him at the same tier as someone like Edouard. The reason being Edouard has just a great ceiling with Nottingham Forest, and Scamacca, as I said, is probably with the worst amount of minutes projected for any of these players here within that kind of cheap territory. Antonio could find his way towards playing at any point in time. I still like Scamacca as an option, but you really are still looking at options like Wilson, like Calvert-Lewin, who probably might present a little bit more value in your team with the kind of nailed-on minutes that they have, and also just how efficient, let's say, the Newcastle offense have been in spite of the Chelsea game being tough. And then also with Calvert-Lewin, just how great the fixtures are in comparison to Scamacca's fixtures. Very, very similar, to be honest. I wouldn't say there's much between the Crystal Palace at home versus Bournemouth away. And when it comes down to it, Calvert-Lewin just has more minutes. And the actual creative ceiling of these teams aren't too different when it comes down to, let's say, Scamacca versus Calvert-Lewin, how they operate as potential talismans in the future. I think, as I said, with West Ham, it's much more interesting to actually look into Bowen as an option to target, or simply just a defender to capitalize on these two home fixtures. For the more expensive options, you have now Jesus and Firmino who've dropped. The reason why I think is because Darwin now comfortably has a great position here. Even though both Jesus and Darwin have tough fixtures, you could really see opportunity for Jesus to actually get a 5th yellow card, which actually does put him in doubt as a top option. We've also seen just a wave of, let's say, general unclinicalness and also a lack of confidence in Jesus being able to actually finish. I was watching him live actually in the Europa League game, and once again, he had some great chances to finish, but still was found wanting when it came down to actually getting the goal that he really, really needed to build his confidence back. With Firmino, I just think he's played a lot of minutes so far, specifically because Liverpool have been dealing with so many injury situations, but we could obviously find scope for players like Harvey Elliott to come in and play, Salah to maybe move into a central position in this kind of 4-4-2 structure, and therefore Firmino and Darwin not necessarily kind of, let's say, sharing the position as a striker, but maybe Darwin actually getting the start this weekend and Firmino maybe coming off the bench. Haaland and Kane are still top options. We, of course, have to just monitor the situation with Haaland. I talked about that earlier when we talked about the midfielders. But it is a very easy move to let's say, go from Haaland to Kane if you only want to force one free transfer and, let's say, Foden's able to start. We talked about the option of going for, let's say, KDB and Alvarez. But I do think that actually just changes your team in a very dramatic way, where you could potentially just go to Kane and actually just enjoy, let's say, a fully playing Kane versus a Liverpool team, which is going to be a tough fixture for 90 minutes, and then also enjoying Kane versus Leeds for Game Week 16. And therefore, maybe you can even invest into another City option instead. As I said, this is going to be the landscape for the forwards. Not much has changed substantially. I would say the one option has been really Calvert-Lewin emerging. I still wouldn't say I've been super impressed, because I would say Everton aren't the most creative of teams, but the fixtures are still fantastic on paper, but Solanke is, of course, just really appealing at a much cheaper option than some of these other players here. And that's kind of how I feel like the forward landscape is kind of cut out. With the defenders this week, I really think that the cheat sheet is actually very short and sweet. And the reason why I've actually cut down so many of the 3rd tier and the 4th tier options is because I really just wanted people to focus their transfers on players with great games. And we actually happen to have a very great variety of defenders here who all provide different sorts of value for our teams. Options from, let's say, West Ham and even Everton probably provide the best clean sheet opportunities at a cut rate price. United do have 2 away games, but Dalot has been so impressive, and even Shaw as of late, that I would say that they're still worth investing. Dalot, of course, is on 4 yellow cards. Shaw himself is not. So you might want to move into Shaw if, let's say, you're a little bit more, I would say, risk averse as a manager. But if you are someone who wanted to kind of dip into the risk, hope that Dalot is able to actually play these 2 games, you could also invest into him as well. He just has a naturally high ceiling when he plays with his United team, who have actually proven to be a very, very resilient defense. And Dalot benefits thoroughly within the structure where he plays both quite a actual key defensive role this season, compared and contrasting to the previous years. And also just simply when you look at the attacking point of things, he does play a very pivotal role there. And I think he's really emerged as an option this season, just not necessarily just for FPL, but just simply in open play, and just how he's able to actually provide key chances when you compare his statistics to other fullbacks across Europe. Dunk and Webster are also 2 options very similar to the West Ham and Everton assets that have fantastic fixtures. You might already have Dunk and Webster in your team. I probably wouldn't double up on them, so therefore it makes a lot of sense to actually make sure you have a little bit of diversity in your team. Maybe split the investment in terms of going for, let's say, a little bit of hedging on Brighton, a little bit of hedging on West Ham. I'll probably be a little bit more confident on West Ham than Everton, and that's simply just because they have 2 home fixtures. I don't really think there's too much between them, as we talked about previously, but the fixtures are still fantastic. When we look at some of the Arsenal options or Trippier, I still think that they're also top tier. Yes, of course, both these two teams play Chelsea independently, and Chelsea are actually a team very capable of scoring on any game, even if they're losing, but we still have at least the kind of attacking sword with Gabriel and Saliba on set pieces, and then also with Trippier, who just simply has been so consistent that I really think that there's no reason to even think about him actually dropping as a transfer option. And then Cancelo, of course, remains as a top option. What this does suggest as well with Man City is that you could probably find a third investment if you're looking still for a third City player into someone like Ederson. He has great opportunities to keep clean sheets over the next 2 weeks, so I think he just has a little bit more safety and guarantee when you compare it to players like Diaz and Laporte, who obviously could rotate with players like Stones and so on and so forth. And that's kind of the defender's landscape. And similarly with the keepers, I've actually tried to keep it as simple as possible, removing some of the options that I think aren't really worth considering. The one exception might be someone like Fabianski, who actually has 2 great home fixtures. We talked about the West Ham defenders and their ability to provide points, as well as someone like Bowen. I do think Fabianski is interesting, but he is still a little bit more expensive than some of the West Ham defenders that you have at a much cut rate price. When you compare it to options like Pickford and Sanchez, they're actually cheaper than some of the defenders, which is why you'd probably like to invest into them. Ward and Iverson still top options, just because they actually are existing at that price and probably allow you a lot of kind of price cuts. Nothing's really going to change for them this season. I do think it's actually interesting that we might even think about going for the World Cup with Ward and Iverson, or at least incorporating Ward back into our teams at the very bare minimum. You have Sanchez, of course, who's a great option. These 2 fixtures are fantastic for Brighton. Henderson's also a great option too. We talked about how Nottingham Forest have 2 great home games, Gibbs White being in a differential pick in the midfield, but Henderson's probably actually the best pick to think about from Nottingham Forest. If they can absolutely steal, let's say, a clean sheet from any of these games, we know that they suffer so many shots on target that Henderson could easily get, let's say, an 11 or 12 or 13-point haul. And that's kind of how it works with FPL, right? Because, yes, a team like Everton might get 2 clean sheets, but because they could also dominate these games versus Leicester and Bournemouth specifically, also when you look at Bournemouth, they aren't a team that really creates too many chances, and that really changes the dynamic of these fixtures. So, for example, someone like Ederson, who's probably a better example and probably better counterpoint, he's not really going to suffer many shots on target versus Fulham and Brentford. I might be wrong, and he might concede, a lot of shots on target, but that's not what we expect. Whereas with Henderson, that's exactly what we expect from Nottingham Forest, and that's kind of why he's an interesting differential. If you ever even have to consider a keeper. But otherwise, you've got Pickford, you've got Sanchez, you've got Ederson as well, and then obviously Fabianski is an outside shout too. And that's going to be the Game Week 15 cheat sheet. So thank you guys so much for watching, and I'll see you guys very, very shortly.